Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Hi, welcome. I just want to start us right off tonight at 6:30 because we probably have two open forums to cover in one. It's kind of a hard thing, like they both need their own, but they're both so connected that I thought thyroid and adrenal, let's just go for it. So, a couple of quick introductions. I'm Dr. Hunter Peterson, and this is Open Forum, first Wednesday of every month, 6:30 to 8 in this room. And it is a community event, so patients welcome, community members welcome. And I think of this more as a dialogue, a conversation. So you don't see a PowerPoint or anything, I have a few notes, but really want you to raise your hand. Let's kind of take tangents and directions to places you're interested in. Although I have kind of prepared this set of remarks, you know, and kind of my thoughts on these topics. So you probably noticed me start the camera over here. So this video will be posted on our website, www.cdahealingarts.com. It's on our business card too. So about in a week it should be up, and there's I think about 20 other of these lectures there on all topics health. So if you want to rewatch, get notes, share with a friend, it'll be there. And so one other really exciting and quick thing before I start chatting about adrenals and thyroid, I want to make an introduction. This is a new member of our team, Dr. Mia Grothman. She just started her first week at the clinic. We're very excited to have her here. We are very busy, and our community has a lot of needs for naturopathic services, and Dr. Mia is from Coeur d'Alene and really excited to set her roots here. And so welcoming her to the clinic. And also, this is her first open forum to watch, so she will be doing these in the future with me. And the last kind of part of this is I want to spend a few minutes at the very beginning to open up to any and all health questions, no matter what it's about, actually specifically not related to adrenal and thyroid, although if you want to make sure I'm covering something, feel free to ask it specifically. But I want to make sure at the end of the talk we get to all those. And I'm going to ask Dr. Mia to kind of step up and just kind of walk through those topics with you. So are there anybody who wants to kind of start us off with topics? Yeah, Matt.
I would love to address the cortisol and adrenal function with post-traumatic stress and or chronic pain.
Okay. Yeah, I can bridge that into the chat. Great. And again, it doesn't have to be a question about adrenals, just to clarify our thyroid. Anything and all things. Health questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
What's your thoughts on celery juicing?
Okay. In any particular slant to it, just doing it? Yes. Okay. What else?
I have one question. How important is HRT for women over 60? I know it ties in, it's all part of the endocrine system. How important is that? And what forms are really healthy?
Okay. Great. I can kind of touch the surface of that, but really good to tune into the lecture on hormones that I did in this class if you want to really hear a lot more from me about it. Yeah, cool. Yeah, Matt.
Okay, I'm very interested in, I've just recently come off my thyroid medication, Thyroid.
Yeah.
I'm an older woman, and I was able to come off of it through my diet and all. I'm very interested in finding out how do I keep this thyroid healthy and improve the health of it.
Sure.
And my own ability to function at my fullest.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll blend all that in. Absolutely. Yes?
Yes, I was wondering if there was suggestions you might have for tinnitus.
Yeah. Yeah, I can talk about tinnitus. What else? Yes.
Maybe you could address a little bit inflammation, Hashimoto's, leaky gut, that sort of thing.
That'll be all in there, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And I have other talks we've done on leaky gut and that kind of stuff too. So, yeah, what else? Any and all questions? Yeah.
Okay, I don't know exactly how to form this as a question, but my doc doesn't know what to do with it either, so.
Okay.
I will have symptoms of low thyroid for several months, and then I will switch to symptoms of high thyroid with the tachycardia and all that fun stuff, and then I'll flip back over.
Okay.
It's been staying more at the low side, has no clue what to do with me.
Do we know if it's a Hashimoto's thyroiditis?
Have no clue.
All right, that would be a really great starting point to understand that. We'll talk more
That's
about
what I was
Hashimoto's.
thinking, but I
Yeah,
didn't
talk
know.
more about Hashimoto's tonight. That sounds a lot like that, so,
Okay.
yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, how about synthetic thyroid medication, Synthroid and like the T4?
Yes.
I forget what that's called, versus nature's thyroid.
Yeah, definitely we'll cover that. That's important. Yeah.
Your probiotics, what strain and
Uh-huh.
how many billion?
Yeah, I can talk briefly about my feel about probiotics. Okay.
Are autoimmune diseases like hereditary or
Yeah.
just maybe like freaky?
Yeah, I'll just write cause.
Okay.
Because that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a whole lecture I did on autoimmune online. It's a good one to listen to.
Will you address thyroid issues in children?
I can touch on it, yeah. It's uncommon, but I don't see it a lot, although I can share what I've learned. Yeah. There's one in the back. Okay. Oh, right there, yeah, sorry.
If you had to have a lot of x-rays and PC scans,
Yeah.
what's good to take for the radiation that's in your body?
Yeah. Okay, I'll be more generalized about that, but yes. Not a specific protocol, so that I have. All right, what else? Anything else before we jump in? All right. Thanks, Dr. So, real quick, not that this is ultimately going to decide it, but did anyone have like more of a really wanting to learn a lot about the adrenals? Bigger focus. How about really wanting to learn a lot more about thyroid? Okay, pretty equal. Yeah, that's how it always goes. All right. Just trying to how to allocate my time. So I think I am going to start with the adrenal glands because I think it's a better way to work into understanding how the two work together. And ultimately, that connection's a pretty important thing. So I'm sure some of you don't know anything about the adrenals. Is that some people out there? Okay, great. Yeah, not surprising, because most doctors I talk to don't really either. So at least, no, I mean in terms of it being a functional issue that a lot of people struggle with, in our medical system we don't really see the adrenal glands that way. And I think that's a big problem because in reality I think many of us, especially Americans, adults, are walking around with a lot of adrenal dysfunction. And because it's not what we call pathological, meaning there aren't any really serious tissue changes or destruction that we can identify, it's not really recognized or treated in our conventional medical setting. In my experience, it's an everyday encounter, multiple times every day, that we have to really look at and address if we're treating the whole person and helping in a healing process. So the adrenal glands, let's just get oriented to them. They are these little, I would say maybe kidney bean sized organs. They're very tiny, but they're very mighty in terms of what they do in the body. And they sit right on top of the kidneys. So your kidneys are kind of towards your spine, right at the bottom of your rib cage. and your adrenal glands sit right on top of them. And the main role of those adrenal glands is they're secretory organs, and they secrete hormones. And so there's several layers to it. I'm not going to get into all that. And there's several hormones they secrete, and these hormones do lots of stuff in our body. Hormones, just generally, as an orientation, are substances that exert very powerfully throughout the body via the blood as a medium of transportation. So hormones interface with pretty much every cell in our body, and inside those cells they trigger cascades of events. So hormones are major actors in cellular signaling, and thus are pretty important. So we're going to talk about some of these adrenal hormones and what they do, because that will inform us about when things go wrong. So in those layers of the adrenal glands, you have a hormone called aldosterone, and we're not going to talk about aldosterone much, but basically it regulates kidney function, it regulates electrolytes, what we keep, what we get rid of, and consequently it regulates blood volume too. There are also some hormones probably people are very familiar with in estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, and DHEA. DHEA is maybe not as familiar. It's an intermediary between all those other hormones. Those other hormones, progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, are what are known as the reproductive hormones. Of course, we know that those are made in other places too, the ovaries and the testes. And premenopausally, that is the main place those hormones are made. But they're always made a little bit in the adrenals. And importantly, when women become postmenopausal, they're all made in the adrenals pretty much. So it's important to recognize those, although we're not going to focus on those hormones today and how adrenal dysfunction and those hormones play a role. But it's just important to remember that we care a lot about adrenal function, especially postmenopausally for women, because that's where the residual hormone supply is coming from. The last hormone that we're going to focus a lot on today is cortisol, also known as our stress hormone. That's kind of a term that's coined. There is one thing that is produced in the adrenals that's not a hormone technically, it's a neurotransmitter, but I do want to mention it because it's pretty important. It's called adrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that's the main source of where those neurotransmitters are produced, and of course we think of that, adrenaline surge, right, like fight or flight, and run for your life. So those with a very stressful event, that adrenaline is part of that stress response. So we talk about cortisol, we're kind of sometimes talking about adrenaline too in terms of the physiological effects. I just wanted to make sure to mention that to not oversimplify all of this. But because this lecture would get crazy and we'd all get lost if we tried to get into all of the adrenal hormones, we're really going to kind of hone our focus in on cortisol and the role it plays in our health. So now we're familiar with the anatomy and we're talking about hormones. I want to mention some of the things that the adrenal glands participate in, or I should really say cortisol. So cortisol has a major role to play. It's, like I said, stress hormone, but the sleep-wake cycle is very influenced by it. So we see cortisol levels surge between 3 and 6 in the morning, and then they kind of quiet down to their lowest levels around bedtime. One of the problems that can go wrong with the adrenals is that rhythm can get skewed. It can create sleep issues, and it can create a lot of fatigue if your cortisol's not kind of boosting up when it's supposed to and settling down when it's supposed to. The adrenals have a huge role to play in inflammation and in immune function. They both have a role to play in harnessing and settling inflammation, as well as a role to play in activating the immune system and protecting the body from the consequences of inflammation. Many of you are probably familiar with things called like prednisone or hydrocortisone. These are drugs that are essentially concentrated synthetics of cortisol, very much more concentrated. And they're used primarily in medicine to suppress inflammation and suppress the immune system, because inflammation causes pain and all sorts of symptoms that are unpleasant. And so that's a really important concept about how cortisol works. But it's not just suppressing the immune system, it also helps the immune system be intelligent. Cortisol also plays a pretty big role in metabolism. Both the metabolism of our main macronutrients, proteins, fats, starches, but also a hugely important role in regulating blood sugar. Blood sugar is kind of our main blood-borne energy currency. It's the way that, you know, we kind of are able to level our energy production. So really important, the adrenals play that role. And of course, when the adrenals aren't working, that can be a big problem. Adrenals also have a pretty big cardiac role. So they play a big role in regulating blood pressure. They play a big role in regulating heart rate. Those are things that definitely are a part of their functional space. And I would also just want to take a moment to really talk about the adrenals as part of the fight or flight response. And this is kind of leading us into what happens when the adrenals aren't working so well and how do we get there. You know, fight or flight response is like, you know, protecting yourself from a very severe threat. So our mind says we're in danger, we need to protect ourselves, and there's all these things that happen in the body. One of the big things we do is we secrete a lot of cortisol, which kind of does a lot of these actions. It raises blood pressure, raises heart rate, and kind of allows us to fight or fly. So the thing that's important to recognize and understand is that culturally, societally, we're always in fight or flight, seemingly, or at least most people are. It's much more so than our ancestors were, I guess I'll say. So this chronic fight or flight pattern ends up, you know, really pushing on the button of the adrenal glands to throw out a lot of adrenaline and cortisol, but instead of in short little bursts, very rarely, it's all the time. And that's not healthy for restoration and balance. And consequently, the adrenal glands can get very compromised if this process is perpetually going on. Just want to kind of touch on that, and I have a whole stress open forum we did. We talk about that concept in incredible detail. But it is something that plays into the adrenal situation for sure. So I guess we're kind of finishing and reaching the conclusion of the anatomy, physiology, what the adrenals are supposed to do. Are there any questions around any of that before we proceed? Yes?
Are you familiar with anyone, or have you had a patient who has overcome Addison's disease?
Addison's disease, and we're getting into the pathological part, is a very severe form of adrenal exhaustion. It means that the adrenal gland maybe has even had some tissue destruction. We're talking about conventionally. Those are the cases that actual conventional doctors will technically work with and diagnose. But I have not worked with a lot of Addison's individuals. It's such a rare diagnosis, people with that diagnosis. So I can't say that, you know, I've seen cure. I've definitely seen improvement in it, absolutely using naturopathic medicine. But I can't say if it could be cured in my own experience without any sort of supplemental hormone.
I ask the question because 40 years ago, a medical doctor who referred me to a naturopath in Portland, Oregon, had determined by 6-hour glucose tolerance testing that I had severe Addison's.
Okay.
And through naturopathy, I completely and totally overcame it.
Awesome.
But it was connected by and influenced by chronic hypothyroidism.
Great. Yeah, no, good thing to kind of bring together, and we'll talk more about it. Thank you. Yes, question?
So with what you just said, is there, like,
a truth to sympathetic dominance? Like, is that,
That's what that is, yeah,
so that's what
chronic
that
flight
is,
or
and is
flight.
there a way of getting out of that then?
Of course, yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that in the kind of treatment approach section.
Okay.
And again, it's just a much more in-depth dive in that other lecture, but we'll definitely connect to that.
And that other lecture, is that under a hormone thing, or is that under
It's
a
stress,
natural-
it's about stress, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in the back.
Can you tell me the difference in between cortisol and cortisone?
Yeah, cortisone is actually the synthetic derivative of cortisol. I mean, cortisone is what you can buy pharmaceutically. So it's synthesized, but there is actually an inner conversion in the body where cortisone does also get created. It's just a much less active form of the
So
hormone.
like on a hormone test when
Yeah,
it will do like the cortisol and the cortisol.
show you the cortisone, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cortisone is a lot less physiologically active. It's what's called a metabolite. So probably in the testing you're referring to urinary testing, which is metabolites of cortisol.
Okay,
Yeah, and it can also be given as a drug, cortisone.
gotcha.
Yes.
Do you do the biofeedback machine that shows your adrenals and?
I don't use biofeedback as a tool, personally in my clinical practice. I'll talk about all the testing methodologies I use.
Okay, she had a question.
Yes? Huh?
Yeah, so are the adrenals related to diabetes?
Yes, we're getting more into when they're not working well, what that can look like. Okay. So, I guess a big question becomes, well, how do I know if I have adrenal fatigue, if my adrenals are dysfunctional? Okay, well, I'm using the term adrenal fatigue. There's actually a lot of words we could use to describe adrenal dysfunction. Addison's is a more severe manifestation. It's actually a pathology. But I like the word adrenal fatigue because it embeds within it the main symptom. It's fatigue. There's a lot of nuances to how that fatigue can manifest. Fatigue despite ample sleep, really having to drag yourself out of bed. Fatigue, especially in the middle of the afternoon. Fatigue about 1 hour following meals. That's very common when the adrenals are affected. So those are some things that we often see as chief complaints, which makes it tricky, right, to diagnose, because doesn't everyone have fatigue? It's like every doctor, if you go to a doctor, everyone's going to come and say they have fatigue. So part of the difficulty is, well, where's the fatigue coming from? What organ is really affected? Or are there multiple? Usually it's multiple. And the thyroid conversation, right? What is the main symptom of thyroid? It's fatigue. Okay, so just obviously that doesn't necessarily tell us everything, and if you have fatigue, you shouldn't jump to the fact that I must have a big problem with my adrenals. But it is potentially one of the most common symptom we'll see. One of the big symptoms is things that shouldn't be difficult, just be incredibly seeming like it takes incredible energy and you're really dragging yourself through it, like walking or exercising. People with real adrenal issues can really struggle with that. Recovery from stressful events or illnesses, a lot longer recovery time often. Issues with blood sugar balancing. So we talked about that post-meal fatigue. That can be very, very common with adrenal fatigue because the adrenals are supposed to take your blood sugar when it bottoms out from insulin and kind of bring it back up to baseline. They're not working, they don't do a good job of doing that. Some other things that you might see, certainly poor sex drive, a tendency to become lightheaded, especially when going quickly from lying or sitting to standing, having real difficulty if you're skipping meals, and so I think those cover some of the real foundational things in terms of symptoms to look for clinically. Now there's some ways to check for it too that are both assessment in person as well as laboratory. So I'll just jump into that real quick. One of the best tools in office I do is do what's called hypostatic or orthostatic hypotension. I assess for that, which essentially means you take your blood pressure lying down, and then you quickly stand up and you take it again. If healthy adrenals are there, the adrenal glands are actually going to cause your blood pressure to rise by about 10 points. People with adrenal fatigue often will have their blood pressure drop when you do that. So all you need is a blood pressure cuff, and you can do that assessment. Check it lying, then immediately upon standing. And if you see that blood pressure dropping, we have a pretty good sense there's adrenal issues going on. Another methodology that works pretty well is a pupillary dilation test. You guys know those little pen lights if you go to an optometrist or doctor. Basically, you bring the pen light right onto the pupil, and what it's supposed to do is constrict, and then over time, very slowly dilate. Well, people with adrenal stress, it'll constrict, and then it'll dilate and start going like this, like kind of rapid kind of contraction dilation, like it's kind of wobbling back and forth. It's a very telltale sign of adrenal fatigue or exhaustion. So those are great in-office techniques that can be done, and I do them pretty routinely when I suspect things. I really like to assess it objectively, and someone was mentioning biofeedback. I don't fully feel always that biofeedback is objective, so I like to go in and measure the hormones. And it turns out that it's very, very accurate to measure cortisol through saliva. It's actually not as accurate through blood because in the blood it's bound up, it's not necessarily the active form. There's a lot more kind of confounding factors to assess it in the blood. But the research is pretty strong and clear in this, that salivary cortisol is very accurate in gauging the free form, or the, I call the active form of the hormone. So we use labs that basically you spit into a tube and you send your saliva off in the mail, and they will measure those cortisol levels. I like to do it in a panel that I get all of this, what are called steroid hormones, so the estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, DHEA, because then I can see the whole cascade. When we get into treatments, we'll talk about how that's interrelated. Now, if we really want to look closely at the adrenals, I don't just want to do it in the morning when it's at its highest. I actually want to check it at noon, in the early evening around dinner time, and before bed. So that's a more thorough evaluation. And I think to do that, cortisol times 4, it's like $100. It's not crazy expensive. But it's a really accurate way to get a sense for what's going on. Now there's also urinary, which someone mentioned. The reason I'm not a huge fan of urinary is that it's measuring metabolites of cortisol, and there's a lot of things that influence how rapidly our body creates metabolites. And generally those 24-hour urine tests are more spendy too, and I like to be as reasonable as possible when we're, running labs and diagnostics. So those are some of the ways we can do actual laboratory assessment around them. There are some other more conventional methods to catch the real serious pathologies, like Addison's, ACTH stimulation. And basically, one thing I didn't talk about in physiology is how the body decides to make cortisol comes from signaling from the brain, right? So ACTH is the signal from the brain to the adrenals to say to make more cortisol or to make less. So you can stimulate that cortisol production with ACTH and assess how the adrenals are working. But that's not a relevant one in my opinion for this topic, which is more functional adrenal fatigue. So any questions about testing methodologies, adrenals? Okay, great. So, all right, big topic. What are the causes? What creates adrenal fatigue, adrenal dysfunction? We already said it, it's stress, right? Okay, but let's kind of broaden that term a little bit, because stress can mean a lot of things. We can talk about physical stress, we can talk about emotional stress, we can talk about environmental stress, and we can talk about infectious stress. maybe we'll tackle some of the more simple ones first. So infectious stress of an infectious origin is you get a really nasty virus, you get a nasty bacteria, you get something that really knocks down your immune system and causes the body to have to do a lot of work in clearing that microbe. Obviously things like Lyme disease, many people are familiar with, is a big one. Like that would very much lead to adrenal fatigue. But even something like a bad bout with bronchitis or pneumonia, or a serious upper respiratory infection, or repeated infections, right? Not just one get-go, but you go all winter getting sinusitis over and over and over again. Then yeah, I mean, that really could run down your adrenals because they have to work really hard to support the body in addressing that and recovering from it. Environmental, I guess that could be really broad, but I think, we could kind of narrow that more toward toxins like, pollutants, household chemicals, inhaled chemicals, smoking.
Mold?
Mold could definitely be one. I would kind of put mold in infectious, but yeah, it's kind of in both categories. Mold could definitely totally, mess the adrenals up. So, I'm just thinking about the things we're exposed to in our environment, right? Plastics, pesticides. Unfortunately, there's a lot of that now in our modern societies. So with the comforts of modern living has come a lot of environmental buildup of things that shouldn't be in our body, and those inevitably affect the adrenal glands. On the physical plane, the biggest one I'm going to mention is food, because I think relationship with food is a huge deal to adrenal health. And part of that is mediated also through the health of the gut flora. We kind of are realizing more and more how, what really governs our health is our gut. And so, the health of our microbiome has a huge influence on the adrenals, and as we'll talk about, the thyroid. So when that's out of balance and there's a lot more inflammation and there's a lot more strain, then the adrenals are not going to respond as appropriately. And I've done many open forums on talking about gut, because as a naturopathic doctor, that's like, the beginning point of everything is a healthy gut. So we won't go into detail tonight. But from the standpoint of food, I want to mention food intolerances, right? Because it's true that all of us, everyone in this room, has sensitivities to different foods. The severity of those sensitivities and what causes them might be different for everybody. But we all eat foods that we don't assimilate well and that our immune system is somewhat hostile to and causes an inflammatory response. Well, the adrenals, as we talked about, have a big role to play in mitigating inflammation. So if we're every single day introducing substances that are generating inflammation, and the biggest source of generating inflammation in the body is food, then that's going to strain the adrenals. So when we get into treatment, obviously addressing that component's a big deal. Another thing that's really a big deal related to food is we talked about blood sugar and how the adrenals have a big role in regulating and stabilizing our blood sugar. Well, we can do a lot to make it easier hard on the adrenals in relation to that. If we're eating really healthy proteins and really healthy fats and a lot of fibrous veggies and that, nice balance there, some complex carbs, we're probably going to, be pretty nice on the adrenals. But if we're eating sugar and processed food and drinking alcohol and doing this on the level that the standard American does, is really hard on the adrenals. Because we are totally ramping our blood sugar through the roof, and then we're plummeting it by eating a refined carbohydrate-centric diet. And then the adrenals are constantly working to stabilize something that's going like this. And it's really difficult on them. It can make them very tired. So I'd say that's one of the big drivers of adrenal dysfunction. Now, kind of saving the biggest category for last, but it's the biggest for sure, which is the mental emotional component of adrenal fatigue. And I'm glad I mentioned in passing, because I forgot to at the beginning, we talked about how the adrenals get their marching orders from the brain. So there is our cognition and our also not just our frontal lobe, our logic, thinking mental center, but our limbic system, which is unconscious and we don't really control. It's our emotional center. Both of those talk to the adrenals. They tell them what to do. So when we are working long hours at a stressful job, when we're having relationship dysfunction or strife, whether it's marital or children or friends, when we're in a setting where we're feeling fear or worrying about finances or worrying about our kids or worrying about when we're going to get food next. It goes on and on and on, and we could just, talk about all the things that are ahead. This is what I worry about, right? This is what I hold tension around. This is what I have irresolution about it. Present, past, future, right? All those things. And our brains, as humans, we have this great gift among all the species of the earth that our brains have the capacity to do very complex things. But as a consequence, as a kind of downfall of that, they don't spend a lot of time in the present. They get very busy, and we get very detached from just the being part. And it turns out that all of that busyness and tension that gets driven by our mental process, the adrenals hear about it, and they respond to it. So, and a lot of this, again, comes down to balance, right? It's like, okay, yeah, the brain can work really hard and work through the stress response a certain amount in the day, but it can't do it all day. Well, we don't necessarily honor that and listen to it, right? So, and again, when we talk about treatments, certainly that balance concept is going to become very big and specific strategies to really hone in on. But the bottom line is that mental emotional stress is the biggest cause of adrenal dysfunction and adrenal exhaustion and fatigue. And of course, in the conventional medical setting, right, we totally disassociate the mind from the body, right? Oh, we'll go see the psychiatrist or the counselor or something if you have, things to work on in the mental emotional sphere. I'll work on your physical issues. Well, that's kind of hard if the adrenals are a physical gland, but the brain, the mind, and the heart center is the one instructing it. Okay, so in naturopathic medicine, with every person I work with, we have to do both because they are absolutely intertwined in the most fundamental way. So, questions so far about how we learn how the adrenals become dysfunctional? Yes?
You were talking about food and the causes,
Yeah.
but you didn't mention caffeine. Would caffeine affect?
Yeah, caffeine, I would maybe, kind of almost move into the environmental realm.
Okay.
Absolutely, I'm glad you brought it up. Yeah, caffeine is it's a stimulant, right?
Right.
So I would say that we could also call caffeine a way to override some of the signaling of our body, right? Is, all right, let's use this stimulant to activate the adrenal response and many other responses in the brain, neurotransmitters. And if we overuse that substance, it can really cause the organs that are essentially compensating for it to get really depleted. So yeah, I think overuse of caffeine can really be a problem, for sure. Yeah, good point. Yeah, in the back.
When medical prescriptions for antidepressants are prescribed for the emotional component, the stress and anxiety,
Yeah.
does the Prozac or any of those, does that affect the adrenals? Does that decrease the adrenal
Yeah.
cortisol output or not?
Yeah. It's possible it does, I would say, but it comes at a very great cost. In the sense that, I would say that it's possible to kind of, lessen the way that we press on that fight or flight response and cortisol response, but it comes at the cost of so many other organ systems and pathways being impacted in a way that we're not necessarily looking for. And I also think that just fundamentally, and this is getting kind of beyond the scope of this, but I'll mention real quickly that, our feelings exist for a reason. And it's our body telling us something about where we are holding irresolution, tension, out of integrity, etc. So when we prescribe those medicines, except in very, very rare, emergent, severe circumstances, we're essentially saying, let's disassociate you from your feelings, from your experience, so that you can keep living the way you're living that's not really working for you. And bring all of these other long-term, lifelong consequences with it for taking that drug, guess what, for the rest of your life. Because if you stop taking it, all the stuff you're covering up and disassociating can come right back. So I just think that it's, you know, from a philosophical standpoint, I have a little more to say about that. But just your basic question, I suppose temporarily, or at least initially, it's possible it reduces some of that responsiveness for some people. Speaking of drugs, I mean, drugs definitely impact the adrenals. I didn't mention that. We were talking about, you know, prednisone. Really get worried when patients who have big adrenal issues call me and say, my doctor wants me to take prednisone, because that really strains the adrenal gland and can kind of shut it right off. So adrenals, prednisone, steroids concern me. Certainly antibiotics and how they interface with the gut concern me, and many other classes of drugs can have an influence on them, but I really wanted to mention prednisone and steroids. And people take all different forms of steroids. They take inhalers for their lungs, they take topicals for their skin, they take injections for their joints. I mean, we use that medicine so much in the conventional world, and it has a real detrimental systemic consequence potentially. So we really have to be careful with it. Any other questions about the kind of causation piece and where we are with things? Yes?
We probably don't want to dive too far into this, but how does the adrenals affect blood sugar?
Yeah, how they affect it is that compound cortisol at the signaling level of the cell and of the liver specifically basically tells those organs to liberate glucose from storage into the bloodstream. Yeah, so then we're moving it into the bloodstream, so therefore it can you know, go into the cell and make more energy.
So it's actually increasing.
It is increasing, and in fact, one of the problems with adrenal fatigue, and I'm glad you brought this up, because when we talk about adrenal fatigue, you guys are all probably thinking, oh, that means not enough cortisol. Not necessarily. That's actually, when I talk about adrenal dysfunction, much of the testing I'm doing identifies high cortisol levels. Now, interestingly, people still will often feel some of the symptoms, but rather than necessarily the fatigue and the exhaustion, often they talk about the racing mind and the agitation and the irritability and the poor sleep. And those people actually have too high of cortisol. They haven't totally, you know, because fight or flight is just pumping through their system, and they haven't exhausted yet. You know, the adrenals haven't shut down yet. And so those people also, as a consequence, one of the side effects can be that they have elevated blood sugar. So one of the main causes of blood sugar dysregulation is increased cortisol output. And especially with those people who have these perfect diets and exercise, but you know, the stress component is through the roof, I often ID blood sugar regulation issues in too high blood sugars. Yeah.
Which then would that lead to the insulin resistant and
Correct.
weight gain?
Correct, yeah, and weight gain. One of the other effects of cortisol, I was just thinking of this earlier that I didn't mention to you guys, one of the symptoms is fat distribution viscerally in the abdomen. One of the main consequences of cortisol signaling is telling the body to redistribute fat into the abdomen or the visceral organs. Which is not a good place to distribute fat because then it envelops all of your main metabolic organs, and especially the cardiovascular ones, and you know, big risk factor for serious, you know, events to happen in the future. But so cortisol, by too much in the system, is going to signal that more. It also signals things like loosening, losing elasticity of your skin. So people will often complain about that in various ways, shapes, or form, or hair, skin, nail dysfunction in that way. And that's too much cortisol is a major driver of that. Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, so we could reframe. That's a big deal, right? Like, actually, most of the people I see with adrenal dysfunction, or at least half, have too much cortisol, because that's the stage of adrenal dysfunction or fatigue they're in.
But moving from that, you get to the stage where you have too low adrenal.
That's right. You can actually exhaust the. Yeah, you actually, and people have come up with these formulas to stage adrenal fatigue, and I don't quite do that because everyone's unique. You know, I just treat the person individually based on the whole picture. So, yeah, that more advanced state of adrenal fatigue, those cortisol levels really plummet. And that's where we see the more I have to drag myself out of bed. If I exercise, it's everything I can do to walk a mile. I mean, even though I'm fit or whatever. So it's more of those exhaustion symptoms that we tend to see. And I talked about another thing that happens, which is, you know, can be really problematic where people don't sleep at all, and we measure their nighttime cortisol and it's very high. And so sometimes we really have to use tools to mitigate those patterns.
How do you reset that?
I'll talk in just a sec about that, yeah. So everyone ready to kind of launch into what to do about it? Okay, great. So again, I'm going to start in the most fundamental places, and this is any lecture you'll hear me do, that's where I'll do, is, you know, start at the root causes, because our charge as physicians is to, you know, treat the cause, I think. Don't want to just treat the symptoms, right? Because if you don't treat the cause, then the body is going to reflect the imbalance, the dysfunction, on a deeper level in some other way. And I just think that's a universal truth personally. So we want to understand, again, that cause conversation is really directly proportional to, okay, how do we treat it? So if we talk about environmental stressors, right, or drugs, right, well, if you're on steroids, gosh, we should work on helping you get off of them really carefully. If you're, you know, smoking or exposed or in a toxic moldy house, or if you're getting repeated infections, we have to figure out how to stop that vicious cycle. And it's kind of beyond the scope of this lecture to go into all those details about how I treat viral illness and how I treat, you know, recurrent sinusitis. But yeah, we got to, you know, address those things and get things stable again. On the level of food, obviously we talked about the pitfalls of refined starches and sugars and alcohol and overuse of caffeine, I guess, and how problematic that is. So we need to, from a blood sugar standpoint, move to a really balanced intake of macronutrients, meaning protein, fat, and carbohydrate. And we need lots of fiber, because fiber is good for the gut, and it's good for metering how quickly sugar goes into the bloodstream. And so from that standpoint, we want to really look at fibrous vegetables as leading, healthy fats like olive oil, clarified butter, coconut oil, avocado, salmon, you know, all your good fats. We want to really be doing, you know, nuts and seeds, clean animal proteins from really clean sources, but not too much. We want to do whole grains a little bit, but we don't want to do the processed versions. And so this is just like really generalized, what are healthy foods? They're basically whole foods. Whole fruits, of course, as long as they're whole and they're not super high sugar. Those are all good concepts. I would also create a caveat to say that people with really exhausted adrenals, you actually are going to be doing them a disservice to fast them or put them on highly carb restrictive diets, because the adrenals have to kind of work a little bit to regulate blood sugar when you're doing something as severe as like ketosis or something, and you're having like no carbs, or when you're going long periods without eating. So these people with really tired adrenals, actually you want to do complex carbs with balanced protein and fat throughout the day, and initially and relatively, you know, frequent, like every few hours. That can change as we heal them, but for that subset of people, that's actually pretty important. Generally, with people that don't have that severe issue, I'm a big fan of intermittent fasting and, you know, for certain individuals, low carbohydrate diets, but that is not the category I would suggest that. We talked about food intolerances and really sussing those out and addressing them. So everyone has their own way to do that, or I should say every naturopathic doctor does. Most general doctors don't believe that they exist. So I guess they do food allergy testing, which is very rare. We're talking about intolerances, sensitivities, which do cause a lot of inflammation if chronically exposed. So, you know, you can do antibody testing. That's something our clinic offers. We don't do a ton of it. We can do elimination challenges, which is the gold standard. Eliminate it for a month, challenge it. If you react to it in a myriad of ways, then you're having a reaction to it. I really like to use genetics. I feel like the science is very concrete, and my clinical results are very good in using our blood type in determining the dynamics of intolerances and sensitivity. So we won't talk about blood type a lot tonight. It's definitely a lecture I've talked about before if you want to learn more. But using that science backdrop can give us a pretty big head start on what foods we really need to be focusing on. And then of course, like I said, those starches, those sugars, those sweetened beverages, including alcohol, which is a more toxic-laden sweetened beverage. You know, those are, what's that?
Kombucha?
Kombucha depends on, you know, if it's fermented nice and vinegary, or, I mean, you know, I'm not a huge fan of prescribing kombucha just because there's plenty of sugar in it too. Not a ton, but some. Yeah, soda, I mean, so all these things, right? We don't need to go super deep into it to appreciate crackers, chips, bagels, pasta, bread, on and on, right? What most of our country eats most of the time. So anyways, those are things we want to really scale back from. And that's the kind of food, physical perspective. One thing I would add to the physical perspective is exercise. And exercise kind of bleeds into the stress sphere, because I'm sure many of us can appreciate that when we exercise, our mood is better, and it's a way to blow off tension and what we're holding on to. So from that standpoint, it's one of our very best tools for stress. But exercise, too, has a huge role in circulation. It has a huge role in balancing cortisol levels. There's actually a lot of research on it. It does a great job of normalizing cortisol. And that circulatory component has a lot of ways in which it supports adrenal function. So yeah, I mean, super critical. Any topic we talk about, exercise is going to be one of the treatments. And it doesn't necessarily have to be vigorous. It could be walking, hiking, yoga, tai chi. It can be more vigorous. Again, people with real adrenal exhaustion, obviously you're not going to start off and say, well, yeah, go do heavy, intensive weightlifting for an hour. That's going to really set them back. So, got to meet the body where it's at if you really have adrenal fatigue, and start somewhere and build, and have support and accountability and structure around how that's going to happen. And ultimately, there's no right exercise. I tell people, what do you like to do? Let's start there. Much more likely to do it if you enjoy it. But the exercise is important. I don't want to gloss over that. Let's get to the last and biggest category, right? The mental emotional sphere and stress. I want to share a couple tools that I think are just really great ones. You know, the first is this concept of balance, right? I mean, if we're fundamentally committed to a philosophy and world viewpoint that, you know, sleep doesn't matter, relaxation doesn't matter, doing nothing is bad and unproductive, then, well, that's going to be really hard to heal someone's adrenals if that's our worldview. So, you know, I think unfortunately culturally it kind of is. I mean, that is, we look at the models of people that are successful, whatever that means, financial, I guess, and have the things, you know, they're leading inherently unbalanced lives often. And so I think that balance thing is just, you know, comes so much to the core of it. It really doesn't just have to be about stress and mental emotional, food and whatever. But the balance piece is huge. So really recognizing, you know, how we create restorative time for ourselves. And sleep is the biggest one. So getting enough sleep is just fundamental. And if there's sleep issues, there's adrenal issues, we're probably going to want to work on the sleep issues as part of what we have to do is we call it an obstacle to cure. If the adrenals are not working and they're curing them, an obstacle to that is getting better sleep. And that comes up a lot because a lot of people don't sleep great. So the sleep piece, for sure, and allocating adequate amounts, I think minimum for adults is 7 hours. Probably most people function better on 8. In the winter, maybe more. In the summer, maybe a little less. Relaxation, right? That concept, right? There's a difference between rest and relaxation. Relaxation is, I think, a much more intentional process. It's actually choosing not just to quiet the physical body, but quiet the mind too, right? So we could go watch, reality TV or the news, and we could say, oh, we're resting, but that's not restful to the body, right? Yeah, so that's actually probably the opposite. So what we want to talk about are things like, creative expression, quality time with people we love and care about, being present with that, our animals, doing meditation or breath work or prayer or spirituality, being with whatever your spiritual practice is and centering your time in that space. Right, those kind of things, and allocating time to that literally every single day. Going on vacation, right, and really going on vacation. Taking a whole day off on the weekend to do what you want to do. Those are all examples of this. One of the exercises I really like to have people do is just take a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle, and then write, makes me feel good on one side and makes me feel bad on the other. And of course, good and bad is a very broad, application, right? It's food, it's supplements, it's relationships, it's activities, it's work or jobs, all those things. I mean, it's literally everything about your life. Does it help me feel my most authentic self, or does it take away from that? That's a pretty good place to start. I mean, right? Like, couldn't we say that relationships and dysfunction in relationships are each source of stress, right? So that would be, oh, this relationship with this person on the bad list, this relationship with this person on the good list. Well, maybe then that starts to create more consciousness around where you want to set intentions to change some patterns. So that is enormously helpful, I think, to do that thinking. And it's not just like you whip it out real quick. I mean, it could be a long process of reflection. So that pertains to so many issues with health, not just adrenals, but I'll still share that. I think one thing to really appreciate is that it's not the stressor that causes the adrenals to fire off. It's how our brain responds to the stress. It's a key distinction. So we could say we didn't make the soccer team and be like, oh man, I'm a horrible, terrible person, my life is over. Or we could say, well that means I'll have more time for my music, right? Reframing, so it's an example of our perspective has everything to do with how we respond to the forces that influence our life. It's a simple concept to talk about. I know in the real world, especially when we have patterns embedded from infancy practically about how we respond to the world, then it's harder to just be conscious of those processes. So again, remember, it's how we respond to stressors or forces, not the actual stressor force itself, in the mental emotional sphere at least. Right? It's like if we're spending all of our time in the future worrying about what's going to happen, what is this going to be okay, right? Something we don't have any control over, can't we just reframe our consciousness and say, well, actually, I guess I can control this moment, and that's really all I can control. I'm going to choose to be in the present. Or you could say the same example for the past. Well, I could rehash and ruminate on all these things, but I mean, it's not going to change what happened, but I can use the past to inform how I set my intentions moving forward. I mean, so again, I'm throwing some like big stuff out here that honestly encompass a huge part of my day on an individual level with people. But it's, to me, the biggest force for if we really want to actually heal a dysfunctional adrenal gland is working on the root causes. Yes?
Are there vitamins?
Yeah, I'm about to head there, so good segue. Were there any other questions before I launch into some of the nutrient stuff? Yes?
Exercise, is there,
Yeah.
if you're trying to deal with cortisol, is there a time of day that is better for exercise?
Yeah, I would say just as a general, concept, when the cortisol really ramps in the morning, it's probably a better time. So in the first half of the day, it doesn't have to be per se the first thing you do when you wake up. There might be certain settings where that'd be appropriate, but earlier in the day I think it's better. I think that's better for sleep cycle. The only time I really don't think it's the best is vigorous exercise right before bed. It's too stimulatory. Yeah. Yes?
Reframing your mind and changing your thoughts is definitely intentional and hard to do. Do you
Yes.
have any recommendations on changing your
Yeah.
thought process?
Yeah, well again, a lot of it, the key to changing is self-observation and consciousness, right? So in order to change it, you have to be conscious of it. So the starting point, I think, is cultivating practices that bring greater self-observation and greater consciousness around the ways that you think and being observant of, that process. So cultivating any practice that creates that space to be present and observe is, I think, where you start with it. So I talked about mindfulness, I talked about yoga, I talked about breath work, I talked about spiritual practice, having really close friends that you can be vulnerable with and talk about the hard things, those are all really, places that can be cultivated. Yeah. Any other questions before we move into some of the medicinal treatments? Okay, great. So one thing I want to mention as we jump into this is salt. The adrenal glands need salt. So for people with adrenal issues, I like to make sure that they're consuming salt. They don't have to do tons of it, and if their blood pressure actually rises, then obviously we want to account for that. But salt is not a bad thing. It's been kind of demonized because its relationship to blood pressure and cardiovascular system, but we need it to survive. It's a necessary nutrient. And the adrenals particularly need a lot of it. So half a teaspoon a day of salt in water or whatever, a great idea is salting your food. I'm not saying you eat a bunch of processed food. That has all those other problems and it has plenty of salt in it. But salting food, adding even a little bit of salt for some people can really help, especially the people with low blood pressure. Extra help. So, yeah.
You mentioned that salt helping the adrenal glands. Right now, it seems like everybody's talking about having that tablespoon of cider vinegar, and that's the cure-all for everything right now. What's the take on that?
Yeah, there's not a lot of science to back that. So while I think there's some benefits in certain settings for apple cider vinegar, there's not a lot of merit to it being a panacea to heal everything.
Wouldn't the acidity be harmful on your teeth?
Well,
some people say take it straight, and then others say dilute it.
Yeah,
I
think that the place I would more refer to apple cider vinegar is in relation to gut health and working with stomach acidity. But in the terms of adrenals, I really wouldn't apply it there.
Okay.
Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, I've heard you say quite often tonight something about high cortisol levels. Well, mine were tested and they're low. So how do I interpret a lot of what
Yeah, I'm going to get to that. Yeah, I'm jumping into that. Yeah. So, yeah.
Is Himalayan salt better than the other salts?
Yeah, I think than table salt than just like, sodium chloride, for sure. I think it's a better version. I like Celtic sea salt. It's my favorite. Yeah. So kind of moving into this concept, right? Like, we do have to talk about, increasing cortisol, decreasing cortisol, right? That's part of the question. But a lot of the things, interestingly, do a good job at repairing the adrenal gland itself, which will either decrease it or increasing it depending on what the gland needs. Now, if we're on salt, I'm going to move over to the other main mineral I focus on, which is magnesium. Huge metabolic tool and hugely utilized in the synthetic pathways of the adrenal glands. So our soils are very depleted of it. So we need extra magnesium. Pretty much everybody does for a million different reasons, but the adrenals really like it. So about 300 to 400 milligrams a day of magnesium, and not oxide, because that doesn't absorb well. Other forms are really good nutrient to use. B vitamins, very important to the adrenals, especially B5 and B6. Really important in synthetic pathways of hormones and adrenal products, but also really important in metabolism and energy production. So a lot of things, B vitamins do a lot of things, but one of the more foundational things for adrenal health. I'd also put vitamin C in that category. And you can get pretty high on dosing. I like to use a powder that's buffered, but it's water soluble, so you kind of need to, if you really want to use it therapeutically, you want to do it through the day. So again, a powder is nice for that, put it in water. But you could do up to 5 grams a day pretty safely.
What if you're eating a lot of fruits? Do you
Yeah.
still?
You can still do more if you really have adrenal issues, but certainly citrus fruit do have a lot of vitamin C in them. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
Vitamin and the brewer's yeast I'm talking about. Okay, brewer's yeast.
Source of B vitamins, sure.
Yes. Now,
Yeah.
how much do you have to take a day to really make that be every?
It's hard to say. I mean, I would say, doing between a teaspoon and a tablespoon a day would be
Something like that?
reasonable. Yeah, I don't prescribe it a lot. People don't love the taste, and B vitamins are so inexpensive, but you could use them.
So if you use the brewer's yeast on your food, you just during a meal?
Yeah, exactly.
A couple times a day?
Yeah, you could do it that way. Yeah.
What was the dosage on the vitamin D?
The B vitamins, it depends. B complex is what I recommend. And usually you want to just look for a version that has activated Bs.
It has what?
Activated B vitamins. Yeah. And I talk probably a lot of these nutrients in some of my lectures I've done about how to decide which supplements to take, which natural medicines, because it's an unregulated industry. That's a lot of things I talk about with my patients too. But yes.
Another question. If one is very careful about trying to eat plenty of B vitamin rich foods, do you still believe in supplementing?
If there's adrenal issues, yes.
If there's adrenal issues?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So then if we go beyond the kind of vitamin mineral structure, I didn't mention that this should be in the food section, but hydration is important, but it's a little tricky. You don't want to overhydrate the adrenals, but if you're not drinking any water, that's definitely stressful to the adrenals. So always water is important. So if we move beyond those main vitamin nutrients, I think I would like to talk about some of the herbs. Some really great herbs, and they're called adaptogens. So they balance cortisol levels. They don't necessarily increase them or decrease them. It's depending on what the body needs. My favorites are licorice, Asian ginseng, which is pretty stimulatory, that tends to raise it. Siberian ginseng, a little less intense than Asian ginseng. Ashwagandha, which tends to decrease cortisol, and is also actually really helpful for the thyroid as we get into that. Ashwagandha, it's an Ayurvedic herb. I'll just write it down.
Do you take them in pill form or what's the best form?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a quick second. Let me get through all the herbs.
Okay.
Holy basil is a really good one. I also like rhodiola, although less so. So those other ones I mentioned are probably my favorites. And in terms of dosing, it's hard with herbs. It depends on the herb, but when you do tinctures and extract them through tinctures, it concentrates the medicinal compounds. It's a little more spendy to do it that way, but usually when I'm treating someone, I'll use anywhere between 2 dropperfuls twice a day to 3 dropperfuls twice a day. And it's usually a blended formula that's individualized to the person. You can do it in a crude herb, like in a encapsulation with standardized extracts. You can also do them in teas. Holy basil tea is delicious. Obviously a little more gentle when you do it in teas. So those are all ways to take herbs. Yeah, back.
Using a tincture off the shelf, is it pretty safe to just follow the directions on the label
I can't say because I don't know what the labels say.
as directed, but if there's no noticeable effect to increase?
Yeah, you got to be careful. I mean, you can overdo this. And one caveat I should say with whether it's thyroid or adrenal is we have to be really careful about how we look at this, because adrenal fatigue, what is it really? It's your body telling you to slow down, to rebalance, to rest, relax, restore. So when we get into the medicines, if we're like, oh, I'm feeling tired, well, I better go take some Asian ginseng. I mean, we're using it in a very, I'll call it allopathic, conventional medicine, almost a suppressive fashion, right? We're saying you can continue to sustain an unhealthy lifestyle as long as you take this thing. And, eventually that leads to a very precipitous fall, whether we're using drugs or natural medicine. So in response to your question about just take more and more, I mean, I don't know, right? That's really an individual question. Yeah.
I read recently that licorice actually is something that raises cortisol.
Typically it does.
For
Typically
people
it
who
does.
have higher cortisol, that's maybe not.
Yeah, I use it more as a synergist, so I use it in small doses, typically in a formula.
I've also heard, with the licorice, that it's not good to take it continuously, but to take time off.
Yeah, in adrenal formulas, often I'll pulse them and take little breaks for a couple of weeks, a month, or weekends, just because, just overriding and pressing that into the adrenals every single day, long term, is probably not the best idea. So I do usually promote that. That's why I check in with my patients who are on adrenal medicines. I like to kind of take little breaks and hear where they're at. I don't like to do it long term often. Now the nutrients we talked about, the vitamins, minerals, long term is super fine. Glandulars are the next category. So glandulars are desiccated adrenal gland from an animal source. Now they're not from humans, they're from like organic lamb or something like that. And you're actually using the adrenal gland. It does have some cortisol in it, but they have this very interesting capability of really being able to restore adrenal glands, depleted adrenal glands. And it's usually the more depleted version people that really are going to do best with the glandulars, because they are more stimulating. They're, I think, more physiologically potent than the herbs are. They're going to act more strongly and more quickly. Of course, the most aggressive version of this is the actual medication, the hormone replacement. So that's where we get into prescribing cortisone, right? These are the people whose adrenals are so pummeled and gone that, they're unresponsive to these other more foundational therapies. Someone with Addison's, is going to be taking the actual hormone because their adrenals are wrecked. Sometimes you can use that for a while doing all the global whole person healing and get the adrenals to come back online. So on very rare occasion, I might do something like that, but very, very rare. Now another way to indirectly support the adrenals is that there's a hormone cascade. So you have progesterone turns into DHEA, turns into cortisol. So a lot of individuals, that's why I like to run those other hormones, especially women, low progesterone, very common picture. I sometimes will like to use those precursors, DHEA or progesterone, or pregnenolone, the main precursor, to help feed that pathway of making cortisol. And that can really be helpful for some people. That, of course, is a much broader discussion of how we decide that, but certainly assessing the whole hormone cascade is something that I almost always do if I'm going to go that direction. I don't just kind of do it blindly very often. I wouldn't recommend you all go take progesterone, because there's a lot more to it than just that. But that's something that can be part of it. One thing I really like to damp down cortisol levels, people who are having trouble sleeping, people who have way too much cortisol, is the nutrient phosphatidyl serum. Really nice, works great. Usually I start with 100 milligrams in people, taking it at night, but we can do a lot more if we need to. So that's a great call. So yeah, that's kind of, not to be rushing us, but I really do want to talk about the thyroid. I know some of you really want me to too. So that's kind of big overview of the adrenals and how I approach that. And of course, I'm going to hang out after the lecture, so if you have more adrenal questions, feel free to come chat with me, and we'll kind of break from there.
You said this last thing was for sleep?
It can help with sleep, yeah, but not necessarily, right? It's for working with the adrenals. Yeah. So the thyroid gland is also what we call an endocrine organ, right? It has to do with hormone regulation. Let's do anatomy physiology real quick. So the thyroid is a butterfly-shaped gland right on top of our throat, right around where our Adam's apple is. And it's the hormone that it's associated with is thyroid hormone. So there's not a bunch of hormones, there's just one hormone here. Although there's some glands that sit on the back of it called the parathyroid. So it's a little more complicated, but basically we're not going to talk about the parathyroid. We're going to talk about the thyroid. And so like the adrenals, there's an axis by which the brain talks to the thyroid and tells it what to do. So there's that, feedback loop that we got to appreciate that's going on. Also, let's talk about the hormone itself. Thyroid hormone, there's actually two hormones. Triiodothyronine and, I guess, tetraiodothyronine, 4. So it has to do with the amount of iodine molecules in thyroid hormone. So everyone knows about iodized salt, iodine's in the body. Why is it so important? Pretty much because of the thyroid gland. Thyroid hormone needs iodine to be synthesized. So the number one cause of low thyroid in the world is iodine deficiency. Not so in the United States, but in undeveloped countries where there's not ready access to iodine, it's a big issue. Because we obviously have to have the iodine to make the hormone. So we do make two hormones, and it's kind of an interesting little dance they do. So it turns out the thyroid gland makes a lot more T4 than T3, but it turns out that physiologically, how we talked about hormones being signaling molecules that tell the cells what to do, the only hormone the cells respond to is T3. And T3 is a lot stronger than T4. So what happens to all that T4 you make is that it goes into the periphery, into the body, and it gets converted. The primary places it gets converted into T3 is the liver and the gut. So you might imagine that for healthy thyroid function, we're going to want to have healthy liver and healthy gut. Healthy gut bugs, healthy liver pathways, healthy liver detox. So, because we have less time, I'll just go out and say that if we want to work on making a healthier thyroid, we're going to want to look at those organ systems and see if there's a potential dysfunction. And because we need that good, robust level of T3 to be interfacing with the cells. Then when the body decides, is there enough thyroid around, is there not enough around, then that signaling comes back to the brain. The brain measures all of that and tells the thyroid how much thyroid hormone to continue making. So that thyroid hormone does a ton of things in the body, and funny enough, a lot of it overlaps with the adrenals. So it's, especially why it's such a bummer to me that most conventional doctors only look at the thyroid, because there's so much overlap in the symptoms. Fatigue being the main symptom, but mood disorders, sleep disorders, constipation, dry skin, thinning hair, dysregulated cholesterol, so metabolism, blood sugar, immune function, regulating your temperature in your body is hugely associated with the thyroid gland. Cardiovascular function, heart rate. So again, a lot of this is intertwined in terms of they both influence similar actions in the body, similar physiology. So this little thyroid gland, a lot can go wrong with it in terms of, you know, it seems like in our culture, in our society, that there's a ton of thyroid issues. And I have a few theories for that. I'm going to get into it because I want to share what that is. But, you know, that I talked about the worldwide most common cause of thyroid dysfunction. But in the US, it's something called Hashimoto's autoimmune hypothyroid. And it's interesting because what that is, autoimmune means our own immune system is attacking itself. And specifically, our own immune system is attacking our thyroid gland, not the rest of our body, just our thyroid gland. And when it does that, long term, you destroy your thyroid gland. So, you know, it's gone. It doesn't make thyroid hormone anymore. We can check for that, and I'll talk about in a sec how we do that. But that process, of course, then you have to appreciate, well, if the root cause is this autoimmune process, then we kind of get into this whole other conversation about we need to treat the autoimmune disease, right? Because if we don't treat why the immune system's out of balance, it's attacking itself, then we're not going to fix the thyroid issue. Just giving someone thyroid hormone is not going to address the cause dysregulation of the immune system. And that's the most common thing I see. I see a lot of Hashimoto's. And there are other things that certainly cause thyroid dysfunction. There are some really rare things that have to do with the brain, but that's not very common. Adrenal fatigue, adrenal dysfunction is huge. That's a really big driver of thyroid dysfunction. And a lot of people whose thyroids are treated without treating the adrenals actually do worse. And they have a lot of exacerbations of symptoms, especially like cardiac, I see a lot. When people are treating thyroid where the adrenals are really dysfunctional and need to be looked at too. A lot of times we're going to treat them together. Certainly all the same things that from adrenals apply to thyroid. The stress piece is a little less direct. You know, the mental, emotional piece, it's a little less direct, but it basically is really the same concept with the thyroid. And certainly the gut, food, blood sugar, those concepts in a very similar way affect the thyroid. Just again, a little bit less direct in the way that I described it to you guys. But they're all things we really have to address and account for. So those are really areas that we have to focus if we're going to look to treat the cause. Questions so far? Okay. Yeah, in the back? Uh-huh.
So to really keep a healthy thyroid, one would have to make sure that you are addressing your adrenals probably first then, right?
Oftentimes that's what I think. I'm very hesitant to ever put someone on thyroid hormone before first taking a really good look at the adrenals. Not always, but a lot of times.
Yeah, when I was, this was about 3 years ago, I was put on the Thyroid.
Yeah.
Then I started learning more about taking thyroid medication.
Okay.
And so I asked a few questions to some doctors, and you were one of them. I checked into weaning oneself from thyroid medication by working on the adrenal glands.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that bothered me when I was put on the thyroid medication is after about a month and a half to 2 months, I started having some cardiac issues.
Yeah, it's very common if the
adrenals are
adrenals
so then I started
correct.
really questioning about, well, you know, shouldn't we be treating these adrenal glands first to make sure they're in good shape for working on the thyroid?
Yep.
And so what happened in the end is I actually did end up doing that, and the adrenal gland, the thyroid issue disappeared after doing the adrenal glands. So, okay, and I thank you for saying it right out, because some of this I had to really just kind of go on my own.
Yep.
I did it very carefully, but it certainly did work for me.
Great, that's
and
awesome.
So now my question, then okay, so now what I find is the adrenal glands. So then, obviously the adrenal glands are so important there.
Yep.
That if you're not careful with those, and you're like liable to lose both, that it's a good balance then.
Yeah, I think keeping everything healthy, right? But yes, they're very intertwined. Yep. So, so you know, I want to just speak real quickly to one of the more philosophical, metaphorical pieces that I find with it. Why I partly think the thyroid is such a big issue. You know, like a lot of people have like difficult time speaking their truth, right? So we call this the throat chakra. You know, it's where we speak from truth. And so I think that actually is a pretty big player in why we have all this autoimmune stuff in the thyroid, why we have all this dysfunction there. So inevitably in individual patient cases, I'm treating and there's a big thyroid issue, you know, the mental emotional sphere and how that opens up in their case and how it relates in that realm sometimes to that concept is pretty prominent, because I just scratch my head like, why is there so much thyroid dysfunction in our culture? And I think her point was a big point of that. Well, the adrenal issue, that's a big part of it. But I think that other part is really important too. And the fact that we have chlorine like everywhere, chlorine displaces iodine. It's in all of our water, we bathe in it. So I think we get a lot of our iodine displaced. And for those non-Hashimoto's people, that is a big part of what brings on low thyroid. Just want to share those. So I want to make sure we cover with our time. I know we're getting close, but I want to cover testing, and I want to cover treatment and thyroid hormones and the options that are out there and all of that. So testing-wise, big issue. So it's done by blood. You can do some functional stuff, but I don't think it's that reliable. You can do basal body temperature, which is measuring under your armpit. And if you're under a certain threshold, that can give you a hint that there's a thyroid issue. Of course, we use all the clinical symptoms. But really, I like to use, again, objective assessments. So I use blood draws. We don't use saliva for thyroid. We can kind of use urine, but I don't think it's really good methodology. So it's a blood draw. But the thing about it is there's a lot of markers to get the whole picture that conventional doctors really don't look for. So we need the whole picture. It's incomplete if we just get the TSH, that's the brain surveying how much thyroid's around and telling the thyroid to either make more or less. So a low thyroid function is going to have a higher TSH because the brain's saying we need to make more thyroid. Whereas a high thyroid function is going to have really low TSH. And I'm not even really talking about high thyroid much today because it's much less common, much less common. There's some pretty serious diseases associated with it, and I do treat it sometimes, but I know the vast majority of us don't want to necessarily learn a lot about it, and so I'm not going to really touch on it a lot. Although I will say that people with Hashimoto's, one of the real classical features is it can start with hyperthyroid. Their thyroid can overproduce and then plunge into underproducing. It's a very common way it presents. And in some people with it, it can actually keep doing that a little bit. It can bounce around a lot. And I think someone brought up a comment about how that's going on with them. So we're not going to talk a lot about high thyroid. We're going to talk about low thyroid and how to assess it. So again, and conventionally, that elevated TSH is the only way we tell, oh, there's a thyroid issue, let's give you thyroid hormone. Again, okay, what's causing that? What are the root causes? We don't just reflex immediately to give you the hormone, in my opinion, but conventionally that's what's done. If that number is out of the range, oh, we got to do something, and we got to give you hormone. I really like to test the free hormones. So you have free T3, like we talked about, and free T4. Those are the two hormones the gland makes. So we want to get that whole picture of not just what the brain's saying, but what the thyroid gland's actually circulating. Now, we have to understand that the TSH, the brain response, is a much more steady long-term marker, whereas the free hormones are just a snapshot in time. So, it's all just a snapshot, but it's more labile, those free hormones. So I do lean on the TSH the most, but I still want to see that whole picture. And that becomes especially relevant if we're giving someone thyroid hormone. You know, how is that hormone balancing in their bloodstream, and do they have the right amount of T3 versus T4 in their system? There's the antibodies for Hashimoto's, so you can check for that in the blood. If there's a thyroid issue, or even if the TSH is normal, some people still have Hashimoto's. It's just an early stage of the disease. So you can check those antibodies. They're called thyroglobulin antibody and thyroperoxidase antibody. And those are normal lab tests. They're not even that expensive. So I like to check for that if I have any suspicion whatsoever that thyroid's dysfunctional. There's some other stuff, reverse T3. I'm not going to talk much about that. I haven't found it to be that clinically helpful. Some people who are really in treating thyroid will talk more about it. It has to do with how the hormones interconvert. I don't test it much, so I can't say it's not useful. I just, when I have seen it, it hasn't been that valuable in helping thyroid. So those are the main hormones to check directly related to the thyroid. Of course, you know, checking blood sugar stuff, checking if there's anemia, right? I mean, these are all very valid ancillary things to understand what's causing a thyroid dysfunction. But for thyroid itself, that's what we measure. Now, I want to mention briefly the difference between pathological ranges and optimal ranges. Right? A pathological range is an arbitrary, conventionally metered standard that says, as a bell-shaped curve, if you're beyond 95%, either too high or too low, you're out of the range, and you have a thyroid problem. And so most doctors, because they don't spend time with patients, they just look at the number, and if they see if it's out of the range, it's like, oh, you have a problem, let's give you thyroid hormone. Versus, what are your numbers, but also what are your clinical symptoms? How are you feeling? And can we put the puzzle together to decide, wow, that thyroid number is not overtly out of range, but it's not optimal. And so we got to remember that too. So like with TSH, I think an optimal range is about 0.5 to 2.5. So if I see people out of that range, I'm going to maybe consider, we want to look a little closer about what's going on with the thyroid or the adrenals or whatever, and maybe even consider doing some support around that gland. So it's not just that pathological range we care about, in my opinion. Okay. Any quick questions about testing? We do that. So,
I have one quick question. When they
yes.
say you're slightly out, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, if it's out of that range of 0.5 to 2.5, then I might, if the symptoms accompany it being out of that range, I might really think about doing some focusing on seeing there might be a function, I'll call a functional thyroid issue here.
But if there are no symptoms?
Then probably, oftentimes, I'm not going to worry too much about it. Yeah, but not always, it just depends. Yeah, so when we have the lab markers, we have our evaluation tools. Clinically, we bring that all together. We're looking at the adrenals. Okay, let's say we've done all that, and now we're looking at how do we support the thyroid gland? What if it's not Hashimoto's? Okay, well, maybe they're iodine deficient. So we might want to think about doing a good, well-absorbed version of iodine. I like the herb fucus, F-U-K-U-S. It's yeah, or sorry, F-U-C-U-S. Yep, fucus. It's a really great herb that has a really high standardized. It's actually not an herb; it's a kelp. It's a seed. You know, so sea plants have a lot of iodine in them. So if you really want to support your thyroid in like a real food-based way, eating seaweed occasionally is a really good way to do that. It's loaded with iodine. So yeah, little sushi kind of. Yeah, I mean mostly rice, but there's a little shell there. So you know, looking, and of course we want to evaluate is there lots of chlorine exposure. You know, we can mitigate that in a lot of cases. So that displaces iodine. You know, iodized table salt is the most basic way to do it. But sometimes we want like therapeutic concentrations, like, you know, between 300 micrograms, or sorry, yeah, 300 micrograms and 1,000 micrograms. 1,000 micrograms is 1 milligram. Now you'll see some people that talk about taking insanely high doses of iodine. I am not one of those people that recommends that, because there's a lot of detrimental things that can create, especially if you give it to someone that has Hashimoto's. Really would not advise that. So I'm not talking about superdosing iodine, I'm talking about, you know, physiologically dosing it. Sometimes can be helpful. Now, if people are nutrient depleted, right, we want to think about, well, what are the thyroid cofactors? Selenium, tyrosine, which goes into the production, zinc. Those are pretty key intermediaries that support thyroid function. So we could utilize them. Yes?
What was the second one you said?
Selenium, zinc, and tyrosine, which is an amino acid. Just like in adrenal, we also have thyroid glandulars. A little more strong, but not a hormone. It's glandular, right? It tonifies the gland. So you can actually give thyroid glandulars. Sometimes I will give homeopathic thyroid, which is like a weird version of a glandular because it's actually not the crude substance, it's homeopathically prepared. It's beyond the scope of this lecture, and you can't get that per se at Pilgrims, but sometimes I find that helpful to use homeopathic versions. We can certainly with thyroid address the Hashimoto's component, right? Because that's the autoimmune thing. I won't go too much into it, but I love vitamin D for Hashimoto's, because vitamin D and autoimmune, it's really important to get those levels optimal for that. So usually 4,000 to 6,000 units a day with food tends to be sufficient to get people's D levels into therapeutic range. So, you know, those are a few of the more medicinal treatments that I would really consider introducing to directly support thyroid function if we've done all the work of identifying and treating the cause from an obstacle to cure lifestyle standpoint. Always that's the big main part of it. Yeah?
If taking 4,000 to 6,000 IU of vitamin D,
Yeah.
where does K2 come in?
K2 is, I mean, vitamin K is very readily available in fibrous vegetables. So I don't necessarily supplement it a lot, and I give it a lot in a broad spectrum mineral that contains a bunch of it. There is some research that suggests that vitamin D absorption and balancing is more efficient with K2. But I don't necessarily utilize that concept really prominently, because I think you can readily access the K from the food you eat.
How much zinc a day?
Oh, about 15 to 30 milligrams.
And you said zinc, selenium, and one other thing?
Oh, tyrosine. It's an amino acid.
Tyrosine?
Tyrosine, yeah. Tyrosine.